Perhaps the most famous image of the war in Ukraine was the stalled tank column outside of Kyiv that stretched for dozens of miles. It was a sign of Russian incompetence. Upon seeing that image, Western countries stepped up their aid, believing that Ukraine could actually win the war. They had long feared Russian armored columns. Russia once boasted what was considered the world's most formidable tank force, a reputation rooted in Soviet-era achievements. However, recent conflicts have exposed significant vulnerabilities and inefficiencies in their current strategies and capabilities. Despite its emphasis on tanks, though, Russia has lost a lot of them. Between February 24, 2022 and July 6, 2024, at least 3,197 Russian tanks became casualties. Of these, 2,153 were destroyed, a destruction rate of almost 68%. 355 other tanks were abandoned and 952 were captured. Only 158 were damaged, so Russia can expect to see over 13 times as many tanks totaled as it can expect to salvage after a firefight. These losses are likely understated. The depletion of so many tanks raises an interesting question. How many of them can Russia afford to lose, and why do the losses remain so high? In this video, we'll look at why Russia is actually at risk of running out of tanks and how this will affect its war effort. For now, Russian industry looks like it's keeping up with demand, emphasis on the word looks. Despite optimistic claims from the UK Ministry of Defence and Russian officials about producing 100 main battle tanks per month, these figures are increasingly questionable. Western sanctions and reliance on outdated technology significantly hinder Russia's actual production capabilities. Sergei Chemezov, head of the important Rostec arms-producing corporation, said that Russia had increased its tank production sevenfold in 2023. Viktor Murakovsky, a military analyst of some clout in Russia, claimed that his country's industry supplied 2,100 tanks to the military in 2023. Former President Dmitry Medvedev and current chairman of the Security Council of Russia, the body responsible for national security and strategic affairs, claimed that the country's industrial base could produce 1,500 main battle tanks per year. However, there were a lot of asterisks beneath these numbers. 840 of the vehicles supposedly manufactured were really just taken from storage and counted as new productions. Some of these were T-72 and T-80 type tanks. However, many of them were the archaic T-62 and T-54-55 tanks that had long been retired before the current conflict. Satellite images of Russian storage sites, including some in remote Siberia, show steady removal of the archaic tanks over the course of the war at a rate of dozens per month. These are given some updates and then sent to the front where they can't be expected to survive long. Experts at the Swedish Defence Research Agency were far less optimistic than the Russians and even the UK's defence ministry. They estimated that Russian industry was only capable of producing a much more modest 520 new tanks per year. 124 of these were T-90 variants, 80 were T-80 BVM tanks, and 140 were T-72 variants. Russia still has thousands of tanks in service, but at the rate the Ukrainians are destroying them, 520 new tanks per year is not enough to keep up with current wartime demands. Ukrainian troops are simply destroying them too fast. The numbers might be grimmer than this. Russia has only one tank manufacturer, the Uralgovonzavod company located in Nizhny Tagil in Sverdlovsk Oblast. Ukrainian sources said that this company could produce 20 new tanks per month as of March 2023, which would be less than half of the Swedish estimate on production rates. Even allowing for an increase in production since then, as the Russian economy further shifted to a wartime footing, it would still not be enough to meet demand. Russia's poor use of its tanks on the battlefield contribute to the invaders' armored woes. Russian doctrine has long used tanks inefficiently. Instead of combining arms and supporting tank movements with dismounted infantry, Russian doctrine emphasizes assaulting positions with large waves of armored units in the hopes of puncturing through the enemy line, in a way that can be exploited through sustained movement, capable of reaching operational objectives hundreds of kilometers in the enemy rear. This is called deep battle, and it sounds good. However, deceiving the enemy about the location of the assault and flawless logistical support is necessary to carry out this doctrine effectively. Even when it works, as it did in World War II, these assaults tend to be costly. The Soviet Union suffered far more severe casualties than Nazi Germany, even when it was at the height of its effectiveness. At the Battle of Kursk in 1943, for example, the Nazis suffered 280 tanks destroyed and 1,310 damaged tanks. The Soviets saw the destruction of between 1,600 and 1,900 tanks. When deep battle fails, it produces even more lopsided losses. Operation Mars in December 1942 might be the best example. Sometimes called Zhukov's greatest defeat, the Soviets suffered between 215,000 and 335,000 total casualties, with perhaps 100,000 deaths. The Germans suffered about 53,500 total casualties. The Soviet Union and later Russia learned nothing from this experience. Its victory in World War II elevated the hype around the deep battle doctrine, despite ample evidence that it wasn't the most cost-effective. With Russia's poor logistics and many intelligence failures, the Kremlin was asking for trouble it never knew it would have in Ukraine. It simply lacked the necessary underpinnings to carry out its tank doctrine effectively. Russia's tank losses also come from a failure to anticipate new changes in technology. It often fails to camouflage its tanks properly. Because of this failure and the size and slow movement of its armored assaults, Russian tanks have proven enticing targets for Ukrainian drones. At the start of the war, Ukraine used expensive, high-flying drones like Turkey's Bayraktar TB2. However, Russia's fortunes faded further when Ukrainian drone pilots found their enemies' tanks to be perfect prey for small first-person view drones too. Unlike the Bayraktar, these drones cost between a few hundred and a few $1,000s, yet the Ukrainians have equipped these drones with weapons that can destroy Russian main battle tanks that have price tags of millions of dollars. Russian tanks were among the first targets of Ukraine's FPV drone pilots. Western tanks may have been more survivable against these attacks, but because Russian tanks do not store their ammunition in sealed compartments, damage to the main body risks creating a chain reaction that results in their turrets being blown off, the infamous jack-in-the-box explosions. Of the 12,500 tanks in Russia's pre-war tank fleet, only about 2,600 were main battle tanks. Even fewer of them, a quarter of the 2,600, were truly modern tanks with proper fire control systems that could meet contemporary standards. Of the 3,187 Russian tanks that have become casualties since the start of the fighting, at least 2,547 are T-72, T-80 or T-90 varieties. That's nearly as much as the entire Russian main battle tank fleet before the war started. As of May 2024, Russia was losing tanks at a rate of around 100 per month, but there are some particularly bad days. Oryx documented 13 tanks destroyed or damaged between July 5th and 6th, 2024 alone. Russia's poor use of its tanks and Ukraine's drone tactics, with the able assistance of man-portable anti-tank weapons like the Javelin and NLAW, are creating an unsustainable situation. If Russia continues to lose 60 tanks per month and production rates continue as they are, the number of serviceable units in its fleet will drop below 1,000 2 years from now. As a result, it will lack the armored units needed to meaningfully puncture Ukraine's defensive lines. Despite claims to the contrary, tanks are not obsolete. They're capable of creating forward momentum on the ground in a way that no other arm is. Russia's effective tank fleet dropping below 1,000 will mean any offensives it takes from that point onward will be even more limited in scale and costlier than its current situation. Russia also faces another problem. The replacement tanks it's building aren't up to the same standards as the tanks it had before the war and lost. Western sanctions have made it more difficult for Russian industry to get the components it needs to make the tanks that have the same level of quality. Chinese parts have replaced the Western ones Russia once imported. For example, Russia used to import French fire control systems for its tanks, but Ukrainians are now finding Chinese systems in newly destroyed or captured Russian armor. While these are adequate for now, they are less capable than the older units, meaning that they have a lower life expectancy. The situation resembles a report the Estonian Ministry of Defense created in December 2023, advising that if Ukrainian defenders could kill or maim 100,000 Russian soldiers in 2024, they would be on track to win the war. This is because the new replacements would not be trained to the same standards as the dead and wounded coming off the line. The demand for more manpower would lead to more corner cutting, creating a downward spiral where Russia loses more and more men at a faster rate. Similarly, the new tanks Russia is manufacturing and the archaic tanks it's pulling out of storage are likely to be lost at an increasingly faster rate unless Russia finds a way to better protect its existing tanks on the battlefield and use them more effectively. This would require a change in tactics, equipment, or both. Russia has indeed tried to mitigate the Ukrainian drone attacks by using new tanks equipped with electronic warfare tools like jammers. Such jammers interfere with drone signals and make them lose the ability to communicate with their human operators. With such links broken, the drones are forced to the ground or to return to their bases. There are ways around this, as skilled drone operators can set their desired targets as the bases that their weapons are programmed to return to, but the importance of electronic warfare to counter small drones has increased dramatically in the past year. Russia got the notice and hoped that equipping its tanks with jammers would save them from some of the increasingly skilled Ukrainian drone pilots. These new T-72 variant tanks began to appear on the battlefield last year, with Ukrainian soldiers nicknaming the new model the Tsar EW, Electronic Warfare Tank. They were understandably nervous about this new tank, but would need to capture one to get a true glimpse of its capabilities. The chance came in the spring. In an operation that lasted over several nights in April, Ukrainian troops managed to steal one of these tanks. Braving artillery fire, they drove the tank to friendly territory. Once safely behind the lines, the Ukrainians tested their jammers and, laughably, found that they didn't work. The individual antennas that composed the jamming equipment were factory standard, but the assembly was makeshift. These antennas were tied together with rope atop a wooden shipping pallet. In other words, they were little better than the infamous cope cages. The discovery showed that there was still no systematic, industrial-scale production of tanks capable of countering the Ukrainian drone forces. For now, Ukrainian FPV drone pilots are still wreaking havoc on Russian armored columns with little sign of slowing down. To make matters worse for Russia, Ukraine is greatly increasing its production of FPV drones. In the second half of 2023, it looked as if Russia recognized this and was starting to outcompete Ukraine in drone warfare. But since January 2024, Ukraine has regained the lead. President Zelensky made it a priority to produce 1 million FPV drones this year, and Ukraine was on target to surpass that goal as early as February. Unless Russia can improve its electronic warfare capabilities, many more tanks are set to go up in flames against the ever-increasing screen of Ukrainian FPV drones. When assessing whether Russia will run out of tanks, it's important to examine its ability to repair damaged vehicles, even if the vast majority of them are unsalvageable. Researchers at France's Institut Action Résilience, a think tank monitoring conflict and violent extremism, looked at this question in depth. In a conclusion that might not surprise you, the French found that Russian sources were overstating the capacity of their repair facilities. Russia has 10 major military repair plants, 4 of which specialize in tanks. The Russians claim that the 103rd Armored Tank Repair Plant in the Transbaikal Oblast can fix about 22 T-62 tanks per month. In 2022, Russia was already forced to break these tanks out of storage. Between October, when repair began, and March 2023, the Russian military received 40 tanks from this facility, an average of only 8 per month. The 163rd Armored Repair Plant in Krasnodar Krai is another major facility. In November 2022, 100 tanks were awaiting repair. Satellite imagery revealed that in May 2023, the queue of tanks awaiting repair there doubled, suggesting that the facility was incapable of keeping up with demand. As for new tanks, the French estimated that Russian industry could manufacture 390 legitimately new tanks per year based on the extensive satellite imagery they'd gathered, significantly less than the Swedish estimate. And Russia's tank problems may be even worse. What if the supposedly 12,500 units in 2021 was not truly the case? In May 2024, Institut Action Résilience used satellite imagery from April to September 2021 to conduct a tank census. Examining images from the 22 tank depots which contained 95% of Russia's tanks, the French researchers saw 5,538 tanks stored outdoors. Examining the size of nearby buildings, they determined that 1,900 total tanks could be stored inside them. Furthermore, some of the storage space in these facilities is not occupied by tanks, but rather by other vehicles. Using this data, the French team determined that Russia more likely had a total fleet of 6,000 tanks before the war, with 7,000 being the maximum number. If these figures are accurate, Ukraine has made casualties of over half, or close to half, of Russia's entire pre-war tank fleet. Meanwhile, as we've seen, Russia is not producing or repairing tanks fast enough to keep up with the losses. Russia also faces another problem. More of its tanks have been abandoned or captured than damaged. This is because the Russian military lacks armored recovery vehicles. These vehicles are often necessary to recover damaged or stalled tanks and drag them back behind friendly lines. In mechanized warfare, equipment will inevitably break down, and it's necessary to have compensating measures in place. This is why the US Army deploys about 1 armored recovery vehicle for every 5 tanks. Ukraine sees such value in these vehicles that it's often converted outdated T-62 tanks into ARVs rather than use them in battle, especially with Western tanks arriving to replace them. As of July 2024, at least 131 Russian recovery vehicles have become casualties during the war. Taking these vehicles out produces geometric effects. The loss of each one ensures that more tanks and other armored vehicles need to be abandoned upon taking damage rather than returning to the lines and being repaired. In February, analysts at Britain's Royal United Services Institute predicted that the Russian forces in Ukraine would peak in late 2024. By 2025, their material challenges would start to become apparent and grow worse over the course of the year. The Kremlin believes it can sustain current attrition rates throughout 2025. However, in 2026, RUSI estimates that Russia will have exhausted most of its armored reserves. Like other sources, RUSI concluded that 80% of the supposedly new Russian armored assets are, in fact, refurbishments of pre-existing stock accumulated during the Cold War. This means that if Ukraine can destroy 1,500 tanks per year and 3,000 other vehicles, Russia will likely be unable to supply its forces with sufficient mechanized units at its present industrial capacity. Beyond 2026, Russia will simply not have the material it needs to accomplish its strategic objectives, which will still include the annexation of Ukraine's eastern territories, Kharkiv and Odessa, the placement of a suitably pro-Russian leader in Kyiv, and a guarantee that Ukraine will never join NATO. Russia's only concession is that the rump Ukrainian state will be permitted to join the European Union. Russia still believes it has the offensive ability to demand such terms. Can Ukraine stay in the fight and prove its antagonist wrong? It's producing enough drones but to sustain itself through 2024 and 25, it requires support from its Western allies in ammunition, training, and weapons platforms. If Ukraine maintains such support, it should have enough staying power to last through 2025 and bring significant difficulties to the Russian military in 2026. Beyond 26, Russian power will rapidly decay, with the country's industry unlikely to meet the void in demand, although RUSI warns that to make this maximally effective, Ukraine's partners will need to cover key loopholes in sanctions, such as the dual-use permissions that allow technologies with civilian applications to be exported to Russia. Using this loophole, China has provided its strategic partner with many of the components and systems that its military-industrial complex needs to produce weapons. If this loophole is resolved, Russia will be able to produce less tanks than now. But could Russia potentially find another source of tanks to offset these predictions and last beyond 2026? Despite repeated requests, Xi Jinping remains reluctant to provide Russia with direct military aid, so China is an unlikely source for new tanks. However, Putin's recent visit to Pyongyang and the defense agreement that came out of it raises a new possibility. North Korea had the world's second-largest tank force in 2024, with an estimated 5,845 units. Despite the large number, though, most of these are outdated Soviet designs that Russia had been forced to turn to in its own fleet. North Korea supposedly has more modern tanks at its disposal, such as the domestically designed Chonma-ho and Popkong-ho. However, these are also based on Soviet-era designs and are unlikely to stand up to the threats Ukraine can now field. Some of Russia's own military bloggers call the North Korean tanks weak and pathetic. For now, Russia doesn't seem interested in its new allies' tanks. It's primarily interested in artillery shells and rockets. Despite Ukraine's success and expert analysis, some caution is warranted. Other experts, including those at the UK Ministry of Defence and the Institute for the Study of War, have asserted that Russia will not run out of tanks. However, much of the information concerning its existing tank capacity is good for Ukraine. There is a difference between running out of tanks and being able to field enough to carry out significant armored operations. One thing is clear: Russia's once feared tank force, a fear that stretches far back into Soviet days, has seen its reputation go up in smoke, literally. If Ukraine can keep getting the weapons it needs, it can keep destroying them for cents on the dollar, since Russia seems incapable of improving how it uses its tanks on the battlefield. But what do you think about Russian tank problems? Is it at risk of running out of tanks by 2026? If it doesn't run out of tanks, what will the reduced tank fleet size mean for its war effort? Don't forget to let us know in the comments. Also, make sure to hit the like button and subscribe for more military analysis from military experts. Now go and check out Russia is running out of everything: planes, ships, soldiers, tanks. Or click this other video instead.